Before anyone in the VIP lounge noticed the champagne going flat in their glasses, before the concierge adjusted his tie and looked the other way, a woman in a borrowed white dress stood at the velvet rope and heard the words that would unravel the most important night of her life. "I'm sorry, ma'am. This area is reserved for the Casolari party. Your name doesn't appear to be on the list." She held up the invitation, printed on ivory cardstock, gold embossed lettering, her name right there in the center, clear as morning. The concierge glanced at it, then glanced behind her at the man in the tailored black suit who had been watching from the far end of the bar. The man gave a single, barely visible shake of his head. The concierge looked back at her. "I'm afraid there's been an error." There had been no error, and every person in that room knew it. 30 feet away, seated in a leather chair with a glass of scotch he hadn't touched, a man who had buried 3 rivals and never lost a night of sleep over it, felt something he hadn't felt in decades. Disgust, not at the woman, at the room. The Meridian Club occupied the entire 14th floor of the Alderan Hotel in the old banking district of Carvel. It was not the kind of place that advertised. There was no sign on the street, no listing in any directory, no website. You either knew about the Meridian or you didn't. And if you didn't, you were not the kind of person it wanted. The lounge itself was designed to make certain people feel like they belonged, and everyone else feel like a mistake. The floors were black marble veined with silver. The lighting came from recessed fixtures that cast everything in a warm amber glow, the kind that made expensive watches gleam and cheap fabric look worse. The furniture was low-slung Italian leather, arranged in clusters that created invisible territories, each grouping a small kingdom, each kingdom occupied by people who measured the world in bloodlines, net worth, and the particular cruelty of knowing exactly who didn't belong. The bar ran the length of the eastern wall, backed by a mirror that reflected the room in a way that let everyone see everyone else without appearing to look. It was a room built for observation, for judgment, for the quiet, surgical violence of social exclusion. The music was low. A jazz trio played behind a frosted glass partition. Piano, upright bass, muted trumpet. The kind of music that existed not to be heard, but to fill the silences between conversations that were never as casual as they sounded. On this particular evening, the Meridian had been reserved for an engagement party. The Casolari Brannick engagement. 2 families, one with a name that opened doors across 3 continents. The other with a name that no one in this room had heard before 6 months ago, and most wished they still hadn't. The champagne was Dom Perignon. The canapés were hand-assembled by a chef whose restaurant had a 4-month waiting list. The guest list was 72 people, each one selected with the precision of a surgical instrument. And the bride had just been stopped at the door of her own engagement party. Her name was Sable Merchio. She was 27 years old. She had dark auburn hair that she had spent 40 minutes curling that evening with a borrowed iron in the bathroom of a studio apartment that was 11 feet wide. Her eyes were the color of wet pine, green with something darker underneath. And right now they held the particular stillness of a woman who was deciding whether to fight or disappear. The dress was not hers. It belonged to a woman named Philippa, who worked the morning shift at the same bakery where Sable had worked for 3 years. Philippa had worn it to her own daughter's christening and had offered it to Sable with the words, "It's not a gown, but it's white, and it fits, and nobody needs to know." Sable had taken it home and spent 2 evenings altering the hem by hand with a needle and thread she'd bought from a fabric shop on Garvey Street. The stitches were small even, and invisible, unless you knew where to look. That was the thing about Sable Merceo. She had been making invisible repairs her entire life. She had grown up in Tarrant Falls, a mill town 40 minutes south of Carvel where the main street had 3 bars, 1 pharmacy, and a church with a bell that hadn't rung since 2014. Her mother, Daria, had worked as a seamstress in a curtain factory until the factory closed, and then as a house cleaner, and then as a woman who sat at a kitchen table at 4 in the morning doing piecework alterations for a dry cleaner who paid her $6 a garment. Daria had raised Sable alone. There had never been a father. There had never been an explanation. There had only been Daria's hands, which were rough and cracked at the knuckles, and which had braided Sable's hair every morning before school with a gentleness that contradicted everything else about their life. Daria had died 2 years ago, a stroke at 59. She had been sitting in her kitchen chair when it happened, a half-finished hem still pinned to the fabric on the table in front of her, the needle still threaded. Sable had found her the next morning. The thread was pale blue. Sable kept it in a small glass jar on her windowsill. She never used it. She never moved it. It just sat there catching the light every afternoon, a small blue ghost of a woman who had never once told her daughter that life was unfair, because Daria believed that saying it out loud made it truer. Sable had met Cale Brannick 11 months ago at a farmer's market on the edge of the Arts District. He had been buying peaches. She had been selling bread, sourdough rounds that she baked at 4 in the morning and carried to the market in a wooden crate she'd built herself from pallet wood. He had asked her which loaf she recommended, and she had said, "The one with the crack down the center. It rose unevenly, but the crumb is better for it." He had looked at her for a moment longer than a customer should and said, "I think most good things rise unevenly." They had talked for 40 minutes. He came back the next Saturday. And the next. By the 4th week, he brought her coffee and stayed until she packed up the stall. By the 6th week, she knew that his family owned Brannick Maritime, a shipping logistics company that operated out of Carvel's Port District and employed over 300 people. By the 8th week, she knew that his mother had died when he was 12, that his father, Aldo Brannick, had raised him with a philosophy that kindness was not weakness, and that Kyle had an older brother named Prosper who disagreed with nearly every part of that philosophy. Cale had proposed 4 months ago on the roof of Sable's apartment building. No ring at first. Just a question asked while sitting on an overturned milk crate, looking out over the rooftops of a neighborhood where the streetlights buzzed and half the windows were dark by 9. He had brought the ring a week later. Small diamond, white gold band. He had apologized for the size. She had told him that if the diamond were any bigger, she'd assume he didn't know her at all. But knowing Sable and knowing Sable's world were different things. And the Brannick family, or more precisely, the people who orbited the Brannick family, had made it clear from the beginning that Sable Merkio was not what they had envisioned. Not in those words, of course. The words were always polished. "She's much grounded, isn't she? Where did you say she went to school?" "Oh, she works in a bakery? How charming." The word charming in the mouths of the Casolari family, who were hosting tonight's engagement party, and whose daughter, Neris Casolari, had once been romantically linked to Cale, was not a compliment. It was a classification. It meant, not one of us. It meant, temporary. It meant, we'll wait. And tonight, standing at the velvet rope of the Meridian Club in a borrowed white dress with invisible stitches, and her mother's memory sitting like a blue thread in a jar on a windowsill 11 miles away, Sable Murcio understood that the waiting was over. They were no longer going to be polite about it. The first cut came from Neris Casolari herself. She appeared at the velvet rope within seconds of the concierge's refusal, as if she had been waiting just out of sight for precisely this moment. She was 31, tall, with ash blonde hair pulled into a chignon so tight it looked structural. She wore a black fitted dress that cost more than Sable's rent for 6 months, and she carried a champagne flute the way some women carry weapons, loosely, casually, as though the damage it could do was incidental. "Oh, Sable," Neris said, and the way she said the name was its own act of violence. She let the syllables fall slowly, the way someone handles a thing they find distasteful but mildly amusing. "There you are. We were wondering when you'd arrive." Sable held up the invitation again. "There seems to be a misunderstanding with the list." Neris looked at the invitation. She didn't take it. She looked at it the way someone looks at a child's drawing, with a performance of interest that barely concealed dismissal. "I'm sure it's just a glitch. These things happen when the guest list is managed by so many people." She turned to the concierge. "Mateus, let her through, please. She's with Kale." The words landed exactly as they were designed to. Not, "She's the bride." Not, "She's the guest of honor." She's with Kale. A passenger, an accessory, a +1 at her own engagement party. Sable stepped past the rope. The lounge opened before her like a theater, and she understood immediately that she was not the audience. She was the show. The first 10 steps told her everything. A woman in emerald silk glanced at the dress and looked away, with a half-smile she didn't bother to hide. 2 men near the bar stopped their conversation just long enough to assess her shoes, plain white heels she'd bought at a discount store on Morrow Avenue, before resuming without acknowledgement. A waiter offered her champagne from a tray and then hesitated, as if reconsidering whether she was a guest or someone who had wandered in from the hallway. She took a glass. Her hand did not shake. Not yet. Kale was across the room. She could see him near the windows, talking with a group of older men in suits that fit like second skins. He hadn't seen her come in. He didn't know what had happened at the rope. And part of Sable, the part that had spent her entire life smoothing over discomfort, the part that Daria had built with steady hands and quiet endurance. That part wanted to cross the room and stand beside him and pretend that none of this had happened. But Neris was not finished. "Everyone," Neris said, raising her glass. Her voice carried across the lounge with the practiced ease of a woman who had been commanding rooms since childhood. "I just want to say a few words about tonight." The room quieted. Jazz trio still playing behind the frosted glass, but every ear turned. "The Castellaris and the Brannocks have been close for 3 generations. Our families have shared holidays, business ventures, and—" She paused, smiled. "Almost everything else." A ripple of laughter moved through the room, the kind that isn't laughter at all but a collective acknowledgement of something unsaid. Everyone knew about Neris and Kale's past. Everyone knew that the Castellaris had expected a different outcome. When Kale told us he'd found someone special, we were thrilled. Truly. And when we learned about Sable, we were— Another pause. Another smile. Surprised. In the most wonderful way. The word surprised did what it was built to do. It separated Sable from the room. It placed her outside the circle and then drew attention to the distance. Sable comes from a very different world than ours, and I think that's beautiful. I think it takes real courage to walk into a room like this and feel— She gestured vaguely at the lounge, the marble, the amber light. At home. The silence that followed was surgical. Every eye in the room moved to Sable, not with hostility, something worse, with curiosity, the kind of curiosity people reserve for things they intend to study, discuss, and ultimately discard. Sable stood in the center of that silence holding a champagne glass she hadn't sipped, wearing a dead woman's christening dress she'd altered by hand, and felt the air in the room change the way air changes before a storm. Not colder, heavier, closer, pressing against her chest like a hand. Her vision blurred for half a second. Her throat tightened. The backs of her eyes burned with the specific heat of tears that a woman fights because she knows with every cell in her body, that if she cries right now, in this room, in front of these people, they will have exactly what they came for. She did not cry. She lifted her chin a quarter of an inch. She took a breath that no one heard, and she held her ground the way her mother had held hers, silently, invisibly, with a dignity that cost everything and showed nothing. But something inside her had shifted. She could feel it, the way you feel a hairline fracture in a load-bearing wall before the plaster shows it. Not a collapse, not yet, but a giving way, deep in the structure. In the part of her that had spent 27 years believing that if she just worked hard enough, quietly enough, gracefully enough, the world would eventually judge her by what she built and not by where she came from. That part had just been told, by 72 people in Amber Light, that it was wrong, and Sable was still standing. But the ground beneath her felt different now. Tomax Valoran had been sitting in the leather chair near the eastern wall for the entirety of Neris Casolari's speech. He had not been invited to this party. He did not need to be invited to places. He arrived, and the room adjusted. That was how it had worked for the last 30 years, and that was how it worked tonight. The manager of the Meridian had seen him enter, had said nothing, and had personally placed a glass of Lafrague on the side table beside the leather chair without being asked, because men like Tomax Valoran were not guests. They were weather. You didn't invite the rain. You prepared for it. He was 63. His face had the quality of carved stone that had been left outdoors for decades. Still defined, still angular, but softened in places by time and erosion. His eyes were dark brown, nearly black, and had the flat, patient quality of a man who had learned before the age of 10 that showing emotion was a luxury he could not afford. His hands were large and still. His suit was dark navy, Italian cut, understated in the way that only expensive things can be. It announced nothing because it didn't need to. He operated a network that stretched from Carvel's port district to 4 neighboring cities. Import, export, logistics, consultation. Those were the words his attorneys used. The other words, the ones spoken in courthouse hallways and precinct break rooms and the back offices of politicians who returned his phone calls within the hour. Those words were never said to his face. He employed over 150 men. He had a reputation that functioned like gravity, invisible, constant, and inadvisable to test. But Tomax Valoran had not always been this. Once he had been a boy named Tomach, who wore his older cousin's shoes because his mother couldn't afford new ones. Once he had been a child sitting in the back row of a church in Reskovac, a village so small it didn't appear on most maps, watching his mother kneel and pray for something she never named out loud. Once he had been 9 years old, standing in the doorway of a social club in the old neighborhood, watching 3 men in suits laugh at his mother because she had mispronounced a word while asking about a cleaning job. They had repeated the word back to her in her own accent. They had nudged each other. One of them had said, "Maybe try the alley entrance next time, sweetheart." His mother's name had been Zofia. She had stood there in that doorway with her hands clasped in front of her and her chin level, and had not flinched. She had waited until they stopped laughing. Then she had said, "I am here about the job. Is it available or not?" She got the job. She worked it for 4 years. She never used the front entrance, not because she was told not to, but because after that day, no one ever told her she could. Tomax had never forgotten the sound of that laughter. Not the volume of it, but the texture. The way it was designed not to amuse but to diminish. To remind a person that they were standing in a room that wasn't built for them, and that their presence was, at best, tolerated. He heard that same texture now in the silence that followed Neris Casolari's toast. And something behind his eyes shifted. Tomax did not move from his chair. He didn't need to. His body was still, but his mind had gone somewhere far from this lounge, far from the amber light and the jazz and the marble floors. It had gone to a kitchen in Reskovac, a kitchen with yellow walls and a window that looked out onto a courtyard where laundry hung on a line regardless of the season. Zofia had worked 3 jobs by the time Tomac was 11. The cleaning job at the social club, a morning shift sorting mail at a distribution center. And on weekends, she sewed dresses for women in the neighborhood who couldn't afford a proper tailor, but wanted to look proper for church on Sunday. She charged almost nothing. She worked by the window for the light because the overhead bulb had burned out, and replacing it cost money that went to Tomax's school shoes instead. She never spoke about what happened at the social club. She never told him about the laughter or the front entrance or the word they had mocked. He had seen it himself, standing in that doorway, small enough to go unnoticed, and he had carried it inside him the way a river carries a stone, silently, constantly, wearing a groove that deepened with every year. Zofia had died when Tomach was 16. Pneumonia. She had gone to the hospital too late because going to the hospital cost money, and money was for Tomax's winter coat. Tomax's books. Tomax's one chance to become something other than what Reskovac had planned for him. She had sat in that yellow kitchen coughing for 2 weeks, waving off his concern with the same hand that sewed Sunday dresses, and by the time a neighbor finally drove her to the clinic, her lungs were filled with fluid, and her body had made its decision. He had stood beside her bed in a hallway of a hospital that smelled like bleach and failure, and she had looked at him with eyes that were already leaving and said, "Don't be angry, Tomax. Angry is easy. Be something they have to take seriously." He had spent the next 47 years becoming something they had to take seriously. And somewhere along the way, the boy in the doorway had been walled off, sealed behind decisions that required a different kind of man, a man who didn't flinch, a man who didn't remember kitchens with yellow walls. But tonight, watching a young woman in a white dress stand in the center of a room that was laughing at her without making a sound, the wall cracked. He watched Sable Mercio hold her chin level. He watched her refuse to cry. He watched the way her left hand tightened around the stem of the champagne glass, the knuckles whitening by a fraction that no one else in the room would notice. But Tomax noticed, because it was the same gesture. The same quiet, invisible act of holding yourself together when the room is designed to take you apart. He watched Neris Casolari drift back into the crowd with the satisfied ease of a woman who had detonated something and wanted to watch the debris from a comfortable distance. He watched the other guests resume their conversations with a collective sigh of relief, the way spectators relax after a public execution, grateful it wasn't them. And he watched the young woman's eyes move across the room, searching for someone, searching for the man she was supposed to marry, searching for one face that would tell her she wasn't insane, that what had just happened had actually happened, that the cruelty wasn't in her imagination. Tomach recognized that search. He had watched his mother do it 100 times, scanning a room for one pair of eyes that didn't look away, one person who saw what was happening and refused to pretend it wasn't. Zofia had never found that person. Tomach set his glass on the side table. The ice shifted. The scotch caught the amber light for a moment and then went still. He did not stand up yet, but the decision had already been made, not in his mind, somewhere deeper, somewhere behind the wall, where a boy still stood in a doorway watching his mother hold her hands clasped in front of her and refuse to flinch. Tomac stood. The motion was unhurried, deliberate, the way large objects move, with a momentum that doesn't need to announce itself. He buttoned a single button on his jacket. He left the scotch on the side table, and he walked toward the center of the room, not toward Sable, but toward the space between Sable and everyone else. The room noticed, not all at once, but in a wave. The bartender saw him first and stopped polishing a glass mid-stroke. Two men near the windows broke their conversation. A woman in a silk wrap touched her husband's arm without looking at him. The jazz trio kept playing, but the pianist glanced up from the keys for half a second, the way musicians do when the energy in a room changes pitch. Tomax did not walk to Sable. He walked to Neris Casolari. She saw him coming. Her champagne glass lowered an inch, her posture adjusted. A subtle shift in the architecture of her confidence, the way a building settles when the ground beneath it moves. Neris, Tomac said. His voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. It had the quality of a sound that the room was already listening for. That was a lovely toast. She smiled. The smile was careful. Thank you, Tomax. I didn't realize you were here tonight. I'm always somewhere. He looked at her glass. Dom Perignon. The 2012? The 2008, actually. Ah. He nodded slowly. The 2008 is the one with the longer finish. Stays with you. Like certain words. Said in certain rooms. In front of certain people. The smile remained on Neris's face, but something behind it recalibrated. A mechanism adjusting. A calculation being revised. I trust you'll enjoy the party, she said. I trust I will. She turned and walked toward a cluster of guests near the bar. Her pace was slightly faster than before. Not running. Retreating with choreography. Tomax turned. Sable was standing where she had been, near a pillar between two leather chairs, still holding the champagne she hadn't touched. Cale had found her now. He was beside her, his hand on her arm, his face tight with the expression of a man who had arrived 30 seconds too late and knew it. Are you okay? Kyle was saying. What happened? Someone said there was a problem at the door. It's fine, Sable said. Tomax heard those two words and stopped walking. He stood 6 feet away, his hands at his sides, watching a woman tell a lie he'd heard before in a different voice, in a different decade, from a woman who had clasped her hands and refused to flinch. Kyle looked up and saw Tomach. His expression changed. Not fear. Cale Brannick was not a man who frightened easily, but awareness. The specific awareness of a man who understands that the person standing in front of him operates in a world that runs parallel to his own, but follows different rules. Mr. Valorin, Cale said. Cale. Tomax looked at Sable, then back at Cale. Your fiancée was stopped at the door of her own engagement party. Then she was toasted by a woman who used a champagne glass the way most people use a knife. And right now, she is standing in the center of a room full of people who are pretending nothing happened. He paused. Something happened. Cale's jaw tightened. He looked at Sable. She was staring at the floor. I'll handle it, Cale said. How? The question was simple, but it carried the weight of something Cale didn't have an answer for. Because handling it meant confronting the Castellaris, who had co-hosted this party, who had connections to every significant family in Carvel, who had orchestrated tonight's humiliation with the kind of precision that doesn't come from impulse, but from planning. Handling it meant acknowledging that this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was an operation. Kyle said nothing. Tomax looked at Sable. I'm not going to tell you what to do, he said. I don't know you, but I know what I saw, and I know the difference between a toast and an ambush. Sable looked up at him. She studied his face the way she studied fabric, looking for the flaw, the hidden thread, and the place where the construction would give way. She didn't find it. Why do you care? She asked. Because someone did that to my mother once, Tomax said. In a different room. With different words. And she handled it alone, and it cost her more than anyone in that room ever knew. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. Full of something that Sable recognized, not because she had heard it before, but because she had lived it. The experience of standing in a room that wasn't built for you and being told, in every language except words, that you should leave. I don't need saving, Sable said quietly. I know, Tomach said. I'm not offering to save you. I'm offering to stay. They moved to a booth in the far corner of the lounge, away from the main floor, behind a partition of frosted glass that muffled the music and the laughter and the sound of people performing comfort in a room built for performance. Cale sat beside Sable, Tomax sat across from them. A waiter approached. Tomax waved him away without looking. Sable spoke first, not because she was asked, because the weight of carrying it had become heavier than the risk of setting it down. "It started the first time Cale brought me to dinner with his family," she said. Her voice was steady but thin, like a wire pulled taut. "His father, Aldo, was kind. He asked me about the bakery. He asked me about the bread. He wanted to know how sourdough worked, the chemistry of it, and the fermentation. He was genuinely curious. I liked him immediately." She paused. "But Prosper, Kyle's brother, he sat across from me and didn't say a single word for the first 40 minutes. And when he finally spoke, he looked at Cale, not at me, and said, 'She's certainly an interesting choice.'" Cale's hand tightened on the table. "After that, it was slow, like weather. You don't notice the temperature dropping until you're already cold." Sable looked at the frosted glass. "Neris was part of it from the beginning. She and Prosper are close. They grew up together. She had expected to marry Cale. Everyone had expected it. The Casolari-Brannick merger. That's what they called it. Not a marriage. A merger." When Cale proposed, Prosper called him the next morning and told him he was making the family a target for ridicule. He said the board members of Brannick Maritime would lose confidence. He said the partners, the clients, the old families who held contracts with the company, they would see me as a liability, a seamstress's daughter from a mill town, a woman who sells bread at a farmer's market. She stopped. She pressed her fingertips against the edge of the table, steadying something invisible. Then the campaign started. The Castellaris offered to host the engagement party. Cale thought it was a peace offering. I knew it wasn't. But I didn't say anything because I thought if I was gracious enough, patient enough, good enough, if I wore the right dress and said the right things and smiled through every condescension, they would eventually accept me, or at least stop. Her voice dropped. They didn't stop. They organized tonight. The guest list, the seating, the concierge at the door. Neris rehearsed that toast. I could see it in the way she paced it. Every pause was placed. Every word was measured. She wasn't improvising. She was performing. And the audience was 72 people who now see me exactly the way she wanted them to. Tomac listened without moving. His face gave nothing. But under the table, his right hand had slowly closed into a fist so tight the tendons in his wrist stood out like cables. Sable looked at Cale. "Your brother was at the door tonight. Before we arrived. I saw his car in the valet line when we pulled in. He was inside before us. He spoke to the concierge. I watched him do it through the window." Cale's face went white. "Prosper told the concierge to stop you?" "He didn't have to tell him anything specific. He just had to stand near the rope and shake his head. That's how power works in rooms like this. Nobody has to say the words. The words have already been said somewhere else, in a phone call, over a lunch, in a conversation you and I were never part of." Cale stood up from the booth, his chair pushed back against the marble. "I'm going to find him." "And say what?" Sable's voice was calm, but her eyes were not. "Tell him he's wrong. He doesn't think he's wrong. He thinks he's protecting the family. He thinks I'm a threat. And every person in this room, every single one of them, either agrees with him or is too afraid of the Castellaris to say otherwise." She looked down at her hands, the hands that had altered the hem of a borrowed dress, the hands that shaped sourdough at 4 in the morning, the hands that were her mother's hands, rough-knuckled, precise, capable of making something beautiful out of almost nothing. "I don't have a family name. I don't have a business. I don't have connections or a trust fund or a building with my last name on it. I have a bakery shift that starts at 4 a.m. and a studio apartment and a jar of blue thread on my windowsill that belonged to my mother." Her voice cracked for the first time. "And I have Cale. And right now, in this room, That is apparently not enough. Kale sat back down. He took her hand. He didn't speak, because there was nothing to say that could undo what had been done. The humiliation was already circulating. It was in the glances, the whispers, the slight turns of heads at the bar. By tomorrow it would be in phone calls. By next week, it would be settled knowledge. The Brannock bride. The baker. The girl who was stopped at the rope. Tomax looked at Sable's hands on the table. He looked at the invisible stitches in the hem of her dress. He looked at the way she held herself. Upright, composed, refusing to collapse, even though the room had given her every reason to. And something in Tomax Valoran made a decision, not the kind he made in port offices or private meetings, the kind that came from a place he had sealed off decades ago, from a woman who sewed Sunday dresses for almost nothing and never once used the front entrance. Tomach pulled his phone from his jacket pocket and made 3 calls in 4 minutes. The first was to a man named Benoit, who had managed Tomax's legal and financial interests for 19 years and who answered on the first ring regardless of the hour. I need you to pull the Casolari file, everything. Business holdings, outstanding obligations, board positions, and every contract they currently hold that passes through our channels. Have it on my desk by morning. The second call was to a woman named Ilara Severin. She was not a lawyer. She was something more useful. She was a strategist, a former political consultant who had spent 15 years managing reputations, crises, and the delicate mechanics of public perception in Carvel's upper circles. She had worked for senators, CEOs, and once, briefly, for a foreign consul whose daughter had caused an international incident at a charity gala. Ilara did not ask unnecessary questions. I need you to meet someone tomorrow morning. A young woman named Sable Mersau. She's engaged to Cale Brannock. The Castellaris are running a campaign against her. Social, not legal. I want it stopped, and I want it reversed. The third call was to Harlan Crew, a man who had been with Tomax for 22 years and whose job title had never been defined because defining it would have required language that attorneys preferred to avoid. The Casolari engagement party at the Meridian. I need to know who coordinated the guest list, who briefed the concierge, and who else was involved in the arrangement at the door. Names by midnight. He hung up and put the phone on the table. Sable stared at him. Cale stared at him. What are you doing? Sable asked. Making phone calls. Those weren't just phone calls. Tomach looked at her with the patience of a man who had spent decades learning that explanations were a form of weakness, and then deciding, in this moment, that withholding one would be worse. The Castellaris operate in a world that runs on perception. Who's in, who's out, who belongs, who doesn't. That world has rules, and those rules only work when no one challenges them. He paused. I'm challenging them. Why? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. No. But I owe someone who isn't here anymore. The silence held for a moment. Sable looked at Cale. Cale looked at Tomax. And in that triangle of gazes, something shifted. Not trust, not yet, but the earliest architecture of it. The foundation before the walls. What happens now? Cale asked. Now your fiancé goes home and sleeps in a bed instead of replaying tonight in her head until the sun comes up. Tomax looked at Sable. Ilara will call you in the morning. She'll need your story. All of it. Every dinner. Every comment. Every arranged humiliation. She'll need dates and names and details. Can you provide that? Yes. Can you provide it without softening it? Without minimizing what they did? Without protecting people who didn't protect you? Sable was quiet for a moment. Then she said, My mother never complained. She never told anyone what it was like to be laughed at. She carried it alone, and it ate her from the inside out, and she died at 59 in a kitchen chair with a needle still in her hand. She looked at Tomax. I am not going to carry this alone. Tomax nodded. It was not an approving nod. It was a recognizing one. The nod of a man who understood that the decision Sable had just made was not about courage. It was about survival. About choosing to set down a weight that would crush you if you held it long enough. One more thing, Tomax said. He looked at Kyle. Your brother orchestrated tonight. Kyle's face hardened. I know. What are you going to do about it? He's my brother. He is. And he arranged for your fiancée to be humiliated in front of 72 people at her own engagement party. Those two things are both true. What you do with that is your business. But I'll tell you what I told someone a long time ago. He paused. Family is not a license to destroy. And silence in the presence of cruelty is not loyalty. It's participation. Cale looked at the table for a long time. Then he looked at Sable. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. The answer was in her face, in the invisible stitches, in the blue thread on the windowsill, in every silent, invisible repair she had ever made to hold her life together. I'll talk to Prosper, Cale said. Tomorrow. Tonight, Tomax said. Cale held his gaze. Then he nodded. The next 72 hours moved with the precision of a clock that had been wound by someone who understood exactly how much tension each spring could hold. Ilara Severin met Sable at 9 the following morning in a cafe on Wexford Street, a quiet place with wooden tables and large windows that let in a gray November light. Ilara was 54, with silver-streaked dark hair and the kind of face that gave nothing away until she wanted it to. She ordered black coffee. She opened a leather notebook. She said, "Tell me everything. Start with the first dinner." Sable told her. She told her about Prosper's silence, about Neris's calculated charm, about the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room, about the engagement party at the Meridian, the concierge, the velvet rope, the toast. She told her about the invitations that arrived addressed only to Cale, about the charity luncheon where a woman she'd never met asked her, in front of a table of 8, whether she'd ever considered hiring a stylist, about the dinner where Prosper had handed Cale a printed article about marriages across economic classes and their statistical failure rates without saying a word. Ilara wrote it all down. She didn't react. She didn't comfort. She recorded with the clinical precision of a woman who understood that documentation was not sympathy, it was ammunition. When Sable finished, Ilara closed the notebook and said, "The Castellaris have built a narrative. You're an outsider. You're beneath them. You don't belong. That narrative is currently the only one in circulation. We're going to introduce a second narrative, and the second narrative is going to be true." Within 48 hours, Ilara had done what she did best. She had made 7 phone calls to 7 carefully selected people. A society columnist who owed Tomax a favor that was never called a favor. A board member of the Carvel Arts Foundation who had once been quietly excluded from a Casellari event herself. A philanthropist whose family had started in the same mill town as Sable's mother. Each call was different. Each was precise. None mentioned Tomax by name. The columnist published a profile of Sable Mirceo 3 days later. Not a puff piece. A story. The bakery. The sourdough. The mother who sewed dresses by window light. The studio apartment. The farmer's market where she and Cale met. The piece was written with the kind of warmth that can't be manufactured because the facts themselves were warm. A woman who woke at 4 to bake bread. A woman who altered her own dress by hand. A woman whose mother had worked 3 jobs and died in a kitchen chair and never once complained. The article circulated, not because anyone pushed it, but because it was the kind of story people wanted to share. It moved through the same social channels that had carried Neris's toast, but in the opposite direction. Where the toast had diminished, the article restored. Where the toast had classified, the article humanized. Benoit delivered the Casellari file to Tomax's desk at 7 the following morning. It was extensive. The Casolari family held interests in real estate, hospitality, and import logistics, the last of which intersected with Brannock Maritime at 4 critical junctures. More importantly, 3 of those junctures ran through channels that Tomix's organization controlled, not visibly, not officially, but in the way that rivers don't visibly control the landscape until someone tries to build against the current. Tomax did not use the file as a weapon. He used it as a mirror. He arranged a meeting with Enzo Casolari, Neris's father, at a private dining room in a restaurant that Enzo had been trying to book for 3 months. The reservation had appeared that morning, as if by coincidence. The meeting lasted 22 minutes. Tomac ate nothing. He drank espresso. He spoke in the calm, measured tone of a man who does not need to raise his voice because the room is already listening. He did not make threats. He laid out facts. He described, with surgical specificity, the events of the engagement party: the concierge, the rope, the toast, the coordinated architecture of humiliation. He noted that several guests had already begun talking. He mentioned the article. He observed that public sympathy was shifting and that the Casolari name was now attached to a narrative that was, to use Enzo's own preferred language, unflattering. And then he said one sentence that Enzo Casolari would remember for the rest of his life. "Your daughter treated that young woman the way men in a social club once treated my mother. And I have spent 47 years making sure that the people who operate in my city understand that certain behavior carries certain consequences. Not dramatic ones, not violent ones, structural ones. The kind that take years to undo." Enzo Casolari left the restaurant and called his daughter. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. No one knows what was said. But the following week, Neris Casolari sent a handwritten note to Sable Mercio. It was 3 lines long. It did not contain the word sorry. It contained something more useful: an admission that the engagement party did not reflect the values our family holds, and an invitation to a private dinner to begin again properly. Sable read the note at her kitchen table. She set it down beside the jar of blue thread. She looked at it for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and called Kale. "I'll go to the dinner," she said, "but I'm wearing my own dress this time." The wedding was held on a Saturday in March at a small stone chapel on the outskirts of Carvel. Not the cathedral the Brannocks had used for 3 generations, not the estate where Prosper had suggested holding it. A chapel that seated 60 people and had wooden pews that creaked when you sat down, and windows of plain glass that let in the unfiltered afternoon light. Sable had chosen it because of the windows. She had visited the chapel in January, alone, on a Tuesday afternoon, when the light was coming in from the west, and the dust in the air caught it and turned it into something that looked almost deliberate, like the building itself was paying attention. She had sat in the 3rd pew and looked at the altar and thought about her mother sitting at a kitchen table in Tarrant Falls, sewing by window light because the overhead bulb had burned out. And she had decided that this was the place, not because it was beautiful, though it was, because the light was honest. She wore a dress she had made herself. White cotton, simple cut, with a high neckline and sleeves that ended just below the elbow. She had sewn it over 6 weeks, working in the evenings after her bakery shifts, using a machine she'd bought second-hand from a shop on Garvey Street, the same street where she'd bought the needle and thread for the borrowed dress. The stitches were small even, and visible this time. She had decided that she was done making invisible repairs. The hem was lined with pale blue thread, Daria's thread, the thread from the jar on the windowsill. Sable had used the last of it, pulling it through the fabric with a careful hand, closing a loop that had been open since the morning she'd found her mother in the kitchen chair. It was not a gesture anyone in the chapel would notice. It was not meant for anyone else. It was meant for the woman whose hands had braided her daughter's hair every morning before school, whose knuckles had been rough and cracked, whose life had been measured in $6 garments and Sunday dresses, and a stubborn, inexhaustible refusal to let her daughter believe that the world's cruelty was the final word. Cale stood at the altar in a gray suit. Not the charcoal one from the engagement party, a different one, lighter, chosen by Sable from a rack at a department store in the arts district. He had not argued. He had not suggested his tailor. He had put it on and looked at himself in the mirror and said, "It fits." And Sable had said, "That's because I measured you while you were sleeping." And he had laughed. The real kind of laugh. The kind that starts from surprise and doesn't stop until it reaches the chest. Aldo Brannick sat in the front pew. He was 71, white-haired, with the steady bearing of a man who had built a company with his hands and refused to let it hollow him out. He had met Sable 3 days after the engagement party. He had driven to her apartment unannounced, stood in the doorway of her studio, and said, "I'm sorry. I should have seen what was happening, and I should have stopped it, and I didn't, and that is on me." Sable had invited him in. She had made him coffee. He had stayed for 2 hours. He had asked about the blue thread in the jar, and when she told him, he had looked at the windowsill for a long time and said, "Your mother sounds like someone I would have liked very much." Prosper was there. Third pew, opposite side. He had spoken to Cale the night of the engagement party. The conversation had lasted 40 minutes and had ended with Cale saying 5 words that Prosper had never heard from his younger brother. "Then you'll lose me too." Prosper had not apologized. He had not changed. But he had come to the chapel, and he had sat down, and he had watched his brother marry a woman from Tarrant Falls in a dress she'd sewn herself, and he had not said a word. Sometimes presence without commentary is the beginning of something. Not forgiveness, not acceptance, but the willingness to witness without sabotage. And for now, that was enough. The chapel was full. 60 people. Some from the Brannick side, some from Sable's world, Philippa from the bakery, the farmers market regulars, 3 women from Tarrant Falls who had driven 40 minutes in a borrowed van. The pews creaked. The light came in, and when Sable walked down the aisle, she walked alone. No one gave her away, because no one had the right to give away a woman who had built herself from thread and flour and 4 a.m. mornings and a mother's hands. Tomax Valoran did not attend the wedding. He had not been invited. He had not expected to be. Invitation implied relationship, and what existed between Tomax and Sable Mercio was not a relationship. It was a moment, a single evening in a lounge where a woman had been cut open by the room and a man had recognized the blade because he had seen it used before, decades ago, in a doorway he had never left. But on the Saturday of the wedding, at approximately 3:47 in the afternoon, a dark car pulled to the side of the road across from the stone chapel. The engine idled. The driver's window was down an inch, letting in the March air, which carried the faint sound of bells. Not church bells, but smaller ones, the kind hung above chapel doors that ring when someone enters or exits. Tomac sat behind the wheel. He did not get out. Through the chapel's plain glass windows he could see shapes, the warm amber glow of candles, the movement of people standing, the silhouette of a woman in white walking forward. He could not see the blue thread at the hem. He could not see the stitches or the sleeves or the way the light caught the dust in the air. But he could see the posture, the straight back, the level chin. The way she moved without hesitation, without scanning the room for danger, without the invisible armor of a woman who had been taught by 100 small cruelties to expect the next one. She walked the way Zofia should have walked. Through the front entrance, without apology, without permission. Tomach watched for a long moment. His hands rested on the steering wheel. His face was still, but something behind it was not. Something behind it was standing in a doorway in Reskovac, watching a woman with clasped hands refuse to flinch. And for the first time in 47 years, the boy in that doorway was not angry. He was not at peace. Men like Tomax Valerin did not arrive at peace. They arrived at something adjacent to it. A stillness that was not the absence of turmoil, but the decision to set it down, just for a moment, just long enough to feel the weight lift from the place between the shoulders, where it had been carried so long it had become part of the skeleton. Zofia's voice came back to him, not as a memory, as a presence. Don't be angry, Tomach. Angry is easy. Be something they have to take seriously. He had been something they had to take seriously. For 47 years. And tonight, in a chapel he would never enter, a woman he had met once was walking down an aisle in a dress she had sewn herself, with her mother's thread in the hem, surrounded by people who had learned, some willingly, some not, that she belonged. Not because someone powerful had declared it, but because she had always belonged, and the only thing missing was a world willing to see it. Tomax put the car in drive. He did not look back. Looking back was for men who questioned what they had done, and Tomax had no questions. Not about this. The boy in the doorway had made a promise, standing in a social club watching 3 men laugh at a woman who refused to flinch. The promise was simple. If I ever have the power to stop it, I will not look away. He had not looked away. The car pulled onto the road and moved into the late afternoon light. The chapel bells rang once more as someone opened the door. Guests beginning to leave, laughter spilling onto the stone steps. The sound of a world that was, for one afternoon, in one small corner, slightly more just than it had been the day before. Inside the chapel, Sable Brannock stood beside her husband and felt the pale blue thread against her ankle where the hem brushed her skin. She reached down and touched it once, quickly, the way you touch something sacred. Not to check that it's there, but to let it know you remember. And somewhere on a windowsill in a studio apartment that still smelled faintly of flower and early mornings, a small glass jar sat empty in the afternoon light, catching the sun the way it always had, holding nothing now but the memory of a woman who had never once used the front entrance. But her daughter had.